I'd like to welcome you to New York Heritage Bits and Bytes. Thank you for joining us today. I have some quick housekeeping before we get started. My name is Ryan Hughes. I'm a Digital Services Manager at the Rochester Regional Library Council. I'm joined by my colleague, Tina, as moderators for today's session. We have real-time transcription running during the webinar. You can activate closed captioning by clicking on the live transcription button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can toggle those settings on or off at any point during the webinar. In order to actively participate in the webinar, there are two functions available to you. There are two functions available to you at the bottom of your Zoom screen. One is the Q&A, which you can use to ask the presenter questions. We will have a dedicated time for Q&A at the end of the webinar, so please feel free to submit your questions as they occur to you. We ask that you submit your questions in the Q&A so they don't get lost in the chat. The other feature available to you is our chat, where you can have a conversation. We love to see activity in the chat throughout the webinar, but we ask that you treat the presenter and all attendees with respect throughout today's event. We will drop a link to our code of conduct into the chat. Anyone who violates that code of conduct will be removed from the webinar. Today's webinar will be recorded, and you will receive a copy of the recording within 1 month of the event. We will email a copy of the presenter's slides shortly after the webinar, along with a survey. You will receive a certificate of attendance for today's webinar and a link to the post-webinar survey. We greatly value your feedback and actively update our programs based on what we hear. So please take a moment to fill out the survey at the end of the event. And that wraps up our housekeeping. I'd like to introduce our speakers. Here today, we have Brandon Fess, Special Collections Librarian at the Rochester Public Library's Local History and Genealogy Department. And joining him is Lisa Buda, now Librarian at the Rochester Regional Health. I had the pleasure of working with both of them on this project going back to 2001. The Rochester Public Library received funds from the Rochester Regional Library Council to support the work Brandon and Lisa will be describing. On a personal note, I really enjoyed this opportunity to work with both of them, and whether it was just strategizing about descriptive metadata or discussing time-saving tools, preparing and uploading the collections in New York Heritage, and even just friendly conversations in between the work. It turned out to be a really successful project, and we were able to add quite a bit of unique items to New York Heritage. And so now I'll turn things over to our speakers, Brandon and Lisa, so they can introduce themselves and begin today's webinar. Thank you, and welcome Brandon and Lisa.
So as Ryan said, I'm Brandon Fess. I'm the Special Collections Librarian for the Rochester Public Library. For those of you who aren't from this region, the Rochester Public Library is a major urban public library on the banks of the Genesee River. I oversee our special collections, which include 295 named manuscript collections and many, many thousands of pieces of ephemera, posters, prints, broadsides, maps, and other special collections material. We generally describe our collections as being on par with a mid-sized university. Lisa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Lisa Buda. For this particular project we're going to discuss today, I was the metadata consultant. Currently, I work as a librarian at Rochester Regional Health.
So I'm going to start with some background information about this project, what Rochester Images was, and why we needed to carry out the project. Excuse me. So Rochester Images is a large digital database that contains thousands of historical photographs, illustrations, maps, letters, pieces of ephemera, etc. In general, it's a collection of visual materials. It includes not just Rochester, but the surrounding communities in Monroe County. The collection was assembled over 20 years ago. And to this point, the primary access point had been through the library's catalog, with the ability to filter for images by doing a search under Rochester Images digital collection. Our collections as represented in Rochester Images include a number of notable images from Rochester's past. You can see a couple examples on your screen here, such as photographs of Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass. So Rochester Images has about a 25-year history at this point. The Rochester Public Library was a real innovator in terms of doing large-scale digitization in a public library environment. We started doing imaging in 1997, and by 1999 had 5,800 images created. In 1999, the Rochester Public Library, along with partner organizations, the largest of which being the Rochester Museum and Science Center, received a $300,000 grant from the IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which, as you're probably aware, is a major federal funder of library projects. Under that grant, Rochester Images was formalized as a library project and indeed received the name Rochester Images. The funding received at that time was to be used to digitize 15,000 images from RPL. I'll talk a little more about what that meant in the next slide. And 7,500 images from the Rochester Museum and Science Center from their massive Albert Stone collection of glass plate negatives. Now, the critical thing for today's conversation is that all of these items were to be cataloged using MARC. To put this in context, Dublin Core was a newcomer at that point. Yes, it originated in 1995, famously in a conference in Dublin, Ohio, but it wasn't standardized until approximately 2001. So we were actually working within an environment where there wasn't a standardized metadata format yet, metadata schema yet for digital description. This is also in the very early days of digital asset management. So the idea of using MARC and therefore providing access through the library catalog made sense at the time. Rochester Images on the Rochester Public Library side included material from a number of different sources. As you can see here, yes, the Rochester Public Library Local History Division was one of them. We also received materials from other municipal bodies within the city of Rochester and from a number of the towns and villages in Monroe County, which adds some complication to how the material is organized within the collection, as we have to separate it by source. In terms of the project we're looking at today, the only material that we addressed in terms of doing metadata revision to allow it to be accessed through New York Heritage was material from the Rochester Public Library and the city of Rochester. So the need for the project. If you've not been on Rochester Images, well, it uses a library catalog as a discovery tool, which is distinctly suboptimal. It's not a great access tool. It's not a great discovery tool. Again, you have to use particular language and able to search, in order to search it accurately. Even then, the searching is limited. You're not able to work with it as richly as we'd expect from a discovery tool within a digital asset management system. Of course, the use of the catalog also siloed the collection. It was not visible on the web. Contents from the collection really had to be discovered within the catalog. So the Rochester Public Library already had collections in New York Heritage. We uploaded some collections a number of years ago, the best known of which, and you can see the screen cap here from New York Heritage, showing the 1964 Rochester riot photographs. That's one specific group of images from our collections, and not all of that content was actually within Rochester Images itself. So we had a history with New York Heritage and had made a decision a number of years ago. We would like to get more, if not all of the content from Rochester Images into New York Heritage, which would allow much better access and discovery, as well as removing the siloed element and making it visible to the web. So I started in my position here in 2016, June of 2016. Several years earlier, there had been an attempt at carrying out the required metadata conversion, again from MARC to Dublin Core. Now that project looked at automation, in other words, developing some sort of automated crosswalk that could take the data from MARC and convert it to Dublin Core with little to no human intervention. That method did not work out well. A lot of that came down to the fact that the way that the folks who cataloged the Rochester Images collection approached the metadata involved customization and use of fields that is standard within physical object cataloging, but did not allow clear mapping to Dublin Core. So that project, I don't have much documentation on it. What I've been told is that there were possibly a couple different people who worked on it at different times, and they just were not able to come up with a tool that would actually carry out an automated process. So when I was brought on board, one of the things I was brought here to work on was coming up with a way to improve the visibility of our digital collections. And in my own background, as a graduate student at Syracuse, I'd been involved in simpler data transformations, but nonetheless large-scale data transformations involving, well, manual or what might be described as brute force methods. In other words, taking the data, putting it into a spreadsheet, and either converting it, tagging it, whatever might be necessary for your system, just by carrying out manual manipulation within a spreadsheet. So I suggested perhaps we could do that if we output the data from our catalog and then carried out large-scale manual conversion. Simple technique, and it would allow the necessary human oversight of what was going where in the conversion process. So when coming up with a solution for this, we at the Rochester Public Library sought a Rochester Regional Library Council technology grant, as it was then called, in 2021 to fund the metadata conversion process. To actually do the work, we needed to hire a consultant with experience doing large-scale metadata work to develop the technique and carry out what we planned at that time to be sample transformations. We thought this was going to be a complex process to develop, and at the time hoped to be able to do 600 conversions. That would be 100 from each of the 6 largest collections of material from the library and the city sources. And that's where Lisa comes in. So we hired her to be our consultant.
All right. Thanks, Brandon.
You're welcome.
Okay. So as he said, I was brought in to help wrangle the metadata for these collections. So in my part of the presentation, I want to touch upon the general workflow that was developed for converting a collection. I'm going to show you an example record of basically where we started and where we finished. So what it looked like in RPL versus in New York Heritage. I'm going to briefly talk about the resources and tools that I used to do this, because as Brandon mentioned, an automated strategy just wasn't really practical for this project. And then I'm going to show you an example of the metadata mapping chart that we created, which was really the guiding document for going from RPL metadata over to what New York Heritage needed. Okay, next slide. Okay, so Brandon mentioned the starting process for this, and I recommend this to anybody who's going to be doing this type of work, is to pull samples from your database of records to review, look at the fields that are relevant, ones that are not going to be relevant for exclusion. MARC has a lot of supplementary tags that are just specific to MARC that you're not going to need, especially in a double core based database system. So just review them. It also helps to know what the collection is. So thank you, Brandon. What's in there? What are any peculiar situations with it? Stuff like that. And then you can take that and compare it to the fields that are in New York Heritage or whatever system you're using. So always start with your sampling. After we did that and looked at samples compared to New York Heritage, we developed a workflow for transitioning a collection from one system to another. So the workflow basically came down to, we would request an export of the collection records with the desired MARC elements that we wanted from RPL in an Excel spreadsheet. I would review that data, see if anything weird was in it, because every collection is going to be unique. So always remember that. Just give a quick overview, check for duplicate identifiers. Does something look weird? And then I would check with Brandon just to double check to make sure what we had was correct and what we needed. You know, does the number of records look right? So make sure you're not missing anything. After that, I would run a quick macro just to convert the column headers. So essentially, I would just hit the macro button and would convert from the MARC field to the New York Heritage field. So instead of saying 245, it would say title. And that was just an easy setup in a macro. If you don't know how to do it, you can Google it and watch a YouTube video, because I did that a lot for this project, for learning new things. I'll talk about that with Open Refine, which is what I use to clean up the data. And it was a really great program for just, you're looking at large chunks of data. You can look at it in Excel, but to really analyze it, you should use something like Open Refine. So I highly recommend that. And there's YouTube videos out there for that as well. After I did the data cleanup in Open Refine, and I was happy with what we had, I would export that, run some quality assurance checks just to make sure the records matched what they were supposed to be in the collection. And I would just look at the library catalog to confirm. And then I would email that spreadsheet on to Ryan for upload into Content DM, and Brandon supplied the JPEGs. So that's the general workflow for what we did. Next slide, Brandon. And this is an example of what we started with. On the left-hand side, you'll see RPL. That's the MARC records, what they originally look like. And this is in the user view. This isn't in the back end. I just grabbed samples of like the first 5 fields for comparison. On the right-hand side, it's what we ended up with in New York Heritage, which is in Content DM, which is based in Dublin Core schema, which is much more simplified than MARC records, which has the MARC tags, and then it has the subfields, and a lot of supplementary information that we just threw out at the get-go because we didn't need it. So a good example of when you are doing a conversion from one system to another with 2 different metadata schemas is if you look at the title field between the 2. You'll see that the titles are not the same. So we ran into the unique situation. Well, I guess it's not unique. The titles need to be unique in Content DM. So in this example, in the MARC fields, there are 4 records that have that title. And Brian was like, well, we can't have that. They have to be different. So we're like, okay, what are we gonna do? So we decided, we came up with a system. We would add on to the end of those records the date. If that didn't nullify the duplication, we would add on a sequential numbering system. So that's why you'll see the 4 in parentheses at the end, which means that there is that title with a 1, 2, and 3 also within that collection, but now they're unique. So that's just something you got to think about. You're going to run into those types of situations when you're doing conversion things, and you just work through it and talk with your team to come up with a system that works for you and your particular needs. Another good example to look at is if you look at publication information, you'll see the date, which makes sense for a MARC record, but a user who's looking at this is like, why doesn't it say date? And you'll see in Content TM, it says date of original. So that's it. Dublin Core is just more simplified. And then another example of field names are going to be different between schemas. You can see that the description field in the MARC record, it's called physical description in Dublin Core. So basically you can see we had the MARC record, we had all this metadata, we took it, we reformatted it, and then we popped it into Content DM and got it set for their standards for what they needed. And on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the resources and tools that were helpful for making this happen. The first one was that New York Heritage has a data dictionary, which basically is the dictionary for the elements within their system. So this is an example of the title element. And you can see it has like, does it have a controlled vocabulary? Is this a type of field that's repeatable? What does it map to in Dublin Core? And then any extra information that you're going to need to know when you are entering the metadata and prepping it for upload into New York Heritage. Okay, next slide. All right, other great resources and tools were the Library of Congress is just a wealth of information. If you're doing any kind of metadata projects or digital collections. They have, the authority files, they have the MARC standards on there, and they also have crosswalk templates, which were really helpful at the beginning of this project to kind of look at examples of what, formats for creating a crosswalk or a metadata map. I also just used the Monroe County OPAC because then I could just look at the record if I had a question. And they have a really nice feature where you can click and see the MARC view. So I didn't have to bug Brandon every time I had a question about a particular item. I could just look at it and say, okay, this maps to this MARC field and get my answer. And then probably the most important tool that I used was Open Refine for the actual data cleanup when I was doing the conversion. And you can see here, this is an example of when I was adding on the it's basically the concatenate formula that's in Excel. This is what it looks like in Open Refine has its own expression language. So that saves so much time because you just pop it in there. You could add columns, remove columns. You could look at like how many of this subject do I have, edit it, and it would edit it all at once. So it's a really great program if you're doing something like this. Okay, next slide is actually the last slide. So this is basically a screenshot from the metadata mapping chart that we came up with. And basically this is your guiding document when you're doing something like this. So column A is the fields that are in New York Heritage. And column B is their equivalent in MARC. And then there's supplementary information about if you have controlled vocabularies, this is the mandatory field, stuff like that. And this was a working document. As we went through each collection, I would add on to it. And at the end, I think it was a really valuable document to have for this project and for projects moving forward, because now it's there and we have it. And it's great. So that's my end for metadata talk.
Thank you, Lisa.
Mm-hmm.
I guess what I should add here at the very end is that we originally planned for this to be a sample project.
Mm-hmm.
Do the 600 records just as a test, make sure this was a viable methodology, and then move on from there to a follow-up project to do the bulk conversion. So I'm going to toot Lisa's horn here quite a bit, in that she took what I thought would be complicated and made it very, very simple. So we went in a matter of weeks from saying, okay, can we do 600 items to, no, we're just doing everything.
Mm-hmm.
We're just doing everything.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of 600 items, we completed almost 9,000 items in the collections at hand. The one other thing that we should mention here is that, following up on what Lisa said about needing unique titles, unique metadata for every object, one of the collections we'd really hoped to be able to convert and mount, which is our very large collection of digitized postcards, has not been able to be mounted yet, because in the process of carrying out the metadata conversion and refinement, it turned out the way that the metadata had been written was by groups, by subject headings, essentially, for types, I should say areas covered by batches of postcards. So there's an extensive secondary project that needs to be done now to create unique metadata for every object in that collection, which is about 3,300 more objects that will, once that follow-up project is eventually completed, be added to the New York Heritage collections as well. And with that, I believe we've really reached the end of the presentation, unless Ryan would like to say a few words about his involvement in this project.
Yeah, no, I think that Lisa sort of highlighted some of the role that I played in, get back on the screen, sort of the role I played in terms of kind of working as an intermediary in terms of between getting the digital objects from Brandon and also working with Lisa sort of discussing some of the strategy around doing the metadata work that she was undertaking. And just sort of, this is a sort of a first time project for, I think, for all three of us of this type. And that's one of my roles as a council liaison for New York Heritage here at the Rochester Regional Library Council, and working with our members on New York Heritage projects. So that's, I think, large part of what sort of I was responsible for. And like I said, it was just a pleasure to work with them. I would also invite anybody that has any questions, please add them to the Q&A. That would be great. I did want to just ask a couple things that presentation sort of brought to mind. And I guess I'll start with Lisa. Was there any particular metadata fields in your work that presented a challenge that you could highlight?
I would say probably most people will be familiar with the date field being an issue, because people like to enter dates in very random forms, and it really should be standardized. So for New York Heritage, they use the ISO standard. So once I figured out how to do it in Open Refined, it was really, I won't say easy because it's still always a pain. But I would say if you're doing something like this, the date field, always be sure you're using consistent standard format. And then really the location field proved to be challenging because in the MARC record, I believe they used Library of Congress subject headings for it. And New York Heritage uses the Getty. So I had to figure out how to efficiently convert them because they're just different, the way they look, and the system that they use of, I think it's like, town, city, state, country type of format. So that took some time to figure out how to convert it. So just pretty much anything too with a controlled vocabulary. If you have to move from one to the other, it's gonna be a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, we did get a question come in through the Q&A. It says, were the items divided into collections previously? If not, could you discuss how you identified the collections and divided the items when moving to New York Heritage?
I should probably want to speak to that. Yes, they were previously divided. So, excuse me. The sub-collections, as we were processing them, were divided either by the source organization. So there were distinct collections of material from, say, the Rochester Municipal Archive or the City Hall Photo Lab. And then with material from the Rochester Public Library, there were divisions by format. So collections of photographs, postcards, maps, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And that material, so those divisions were reflected in the processing of the material and the metadata. And you can see those divisions still in New York Heritage.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have any suggestions for an institution that wants to contribute to New York Heritage for the first time?
I think it might depend on if you're working with pre-existing legacy collections versus you're creating a whole, you have a collection that you want to digitize, because those are going to be two different situations. So I think Ryan and I actually have talked about this before. Be efficient in the type of projects you're picking. Make sure they're doable by your organization. Look at your resources, what you have, what you can do, and look at their data dictionary, because it's online. It's really helpful. I still use it for other things in my work. So thank you. So those would be my suggestions.
What I would add there is you should just do it. If you have unique material available through your institution, whether it's physical materials that need to be digitized still or legacy digital data, We need to get that material into the most public possible viewpoints, especially since so many of us, like at RPL, have legacy digital data that is siloed or otherwise not web accessible. So contact your local council and see how they can help you in getting these kind of projects off the ground. Yes, some of them are more complicated than others. Obviously, this is an example of one of the more complicated projects out there. But regardless of the scale of the project, getting past these legacy issues around metadata, format, et cetera, is something we need to be paying attention to at this time, especially if you're starting from physical content. There obviously are some issues with obsolete and obsolescent formats that may be difficult to convert in the future, may be difficult to provide access to in the future.
We got another question. Were there items that didn't get crosswalked/transferred to New York Heritage? If so, what was your selection process?
There's a couple of different answers to that question. On the one hand, there were some collections within Rochester Images that were not converted. Those are the collections that came from the town and village historians. Since they're not the intellectual property of the Rochester Public Library / City of Rochester, we weren't able to provide the support for them to get them converted. That's something that those institutions would need to reach out about in the future themselves. Now, Lisa, correct me if I'm wrong, within all the material that was within those collections from the City of Rochester / RPL, every single one of those was converted.
Right. Except for the one collection you mentioned that needs extensive metadata, but we were able to get them all in there as a collection.
So there had been a selection process back 20 years ago during the original Rochester Images project to determine what material should be digitized at that time. So doing additional selection against those collections was not something we deemed necessary now. They did a good job selecting at that time, frankly.
And I'll just mention that one of the collections that you mentioned that was the Albert Stone collection from the Rochester Museum Science Center, and the Rochester Museum Science Center has a collection of some of those materials in New York Heritage. So that is something that can be, searched and discovered through New York Heritage. The sort of last question I guess I would have is that were there any sort of favorite collections or specific objects that either of you have as part of like working through this project?
I think for me, I liked the vertical file collection, which was the example I used. They just had like the cute old timey invitations and greetings and advertisement cards that I think they're really sweet to look at. So visually, I enjoyed looking at that. So
for me, it's the map collection. Both with the physical and digital maps, I have a long relationship with that specific group of images, in the sense that on the physical side, one of my longtime projects here has been inventorying our map collection, physical map collection. I'm just a map guy to begin with, competed in National Geography, being grade school, stuff like that. So maps really are just a great love of mine, and something I think that can, they exemplify how a picture is worth 1,000 words. You can show somebody where things are, how things worked, et cetera, so much faster with the right map than you can with words in so many cases. So that was a collection I was particularly proud to see made available because there's so many unique maps in our collection.
All right. Let's just give another moment or two, see if anybody else has any other collections, or not collections, any other questions. But in the meantime, I really would like to thank both of you for being here, and I think it's been really great learning session to hear about your project and discover sort of what Rochester Public Library has to offer in the way of digital collections. And I know personally, I'm very happy to see those in New York Heritage right at, now, and look forward to more collections coming in the future. My colleague Tina has posted a link to the survey that we will be sent, will also be in an email. We'd also like to ask you to join us for upcoming events. We have some really great programs that are open for registration, and there is information about how to access those in the chat as well. And I also wanted to mention that someone had added a link in the chat to Rochester Public Library's collections in New York Heritage. So I would encourage you to check those out and let us know what you're looking to learn more about. And I think that's it. I don't see any other collections or other questions. I got collections on the mind. Any other questions coming in? So with that said, I just thank everybody for coming today and look forward to seeing you in the future.
Mhm.